will discuss the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. But as usual, I would like to start with a recap of what we did last week. In the lecture last week, we talked about the labor market. If you remember, we said we're moving from the short run toward the medium run, and now we try to relax some of the assumptions that we made in the first few lectures. We focused last time on the labor market, how wages are determined. We looked at this from two angles. First, we thought about what determine wages, and we said wages, usually when you start a job, you think about not just the nominal wage, you think, or the nominal wage that you would accept to start that job. You will have a number of factors in mind which will help you to decide whether or not to take that job. So one of the factors that we discussed is the expected price level, okay? And also the unemployment rate is important determinant of this, the level of the nominal wage that you would accept. In bad times, when the unemployment rate is high, then you don't have really much bargaining power around that, so you it's very difficult to find a job anyway. And if you already working, then it's very difficult to find a job if you quit your job. So the idea here is that, okay, there's negative relationship between the unemployment rate and the nominal wage. And also we combined all other factors that may affect the nominal wage into one catch-all factor, which we called Z. And we gave an example last week of what kind of factors can be included in this Z variable. We said, for example, like unemployment benefits, or maybe how easy or how difficult to fire a worker, okay, to lay off workers. So these all factors are included in Z, and this variable is positively related to the nominal wage. On the other side, we thought about, okay, how firms decide on or determine the prices, set their prices. We said, if you remember how we came to that point, we said, well, that depends on the output level, and the output level, to do that, we looked at the production function, which is a relationship between inputs and output, and then we thought, okay, if there was only one input, which is labor, and then so from there we just came to the point that we drive this price setting relation where the price will be basically 1 plus M times wages, which means that the firms will set the prices with a markup over the wages or their costs, and in this situation it's only wages, because we assume that there's only labor. Okay, so but in reality, workers care more about the real wage, not the nominal wage. So we made first an assumption that, okay, let's assume that the price level or the actual price level equal the expected price level, and that from there we try to drive the equilibrium in the labor market, in the sense that we wanted to know what determine real wage and also the unemployment rate. So we plot these two together, and the markup on the vertical axis, or 1 over the markup on the vertical axis, to be just more accurate, 1 over 1 plus markup, or the real wage, W over P, and on the horizontal axis we had the unemployment rate. And we said that level, or the unemployment rate, or the intersection point between these two, which you can see on figure A here, that show you the intersection point between both relationships. So both relations. So the price setting relations and the wage setting relations. So the price setting relation is the horizontal line. It's fixed. It's 1 over 1 plus m, plus the m is the markup. And the downward sloping curve here is the wage setting relation. And that point, the intersection point, if the actual price equal the expected price level, that means the unemployment rate at that point is the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, and then from there we tried to think about, or we discussed what determine the natural rate of unemployment. We discussed two factors, as we said, unemployment benefits. So if unemployment benefits increased, that means the wage setting relation, or this downward sloping curve, will shift upward or to the right, and that will increase the level of the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, so the other factor, or the other determinant, is the markup m. So if there's an increase in m, that will bring this horizontal line here, which represent the price setting relation. It will bring it down again as a response of an increased markup, and that means we move from point A to point A prime, which means a higher level of the natural unemployment rate. Okay, so just remember this point here, the equilibrium point, or this intersection point in these three graphs, is the natural rate of unemployment, and that based on the assumption that the actual prices are equal the expected price level. Okay, so but this is not necessarily the case. So that is the issue, or the main issue here. Okay, so this is not necessarily the case. So that means the actual unemployment rate could be somewhere around that natural rate of unemployment. So it could be below or above this natural rate of unemployment. But we also made some comment on that. We said, as we move toward the medium run, so as we have more time, so we move on that horizon, that means it's very difficult to have expectation systematically wrong all the time. So meaning that at some point in the future, at some point when we have enough time, then we would imagine that prices, or the actual prices, will equal the expected price level anyway. So we can converge to that point where which is the intersection point here, which denotes the natural rate of unemployment, which we discuss now. And then we looked at the labor market from a slightly different way. We thought, okay, so we could think of, rather than driving this relationship between real wage and the unemployment rate, we could actually think of labor market as a product, as a market for any product, like any other product. And the product here will be labor, so BN, or employment. And firms demand labor, and households supply work or labor. Okay, and we start thinking about what determine the supply side, what determine the demand side. So in terms of the demand side, basically why firms demand labor, the first factor might come across is the output level, because that's the main reason why firms would demand more labor, if they wish to expand their production or their output. So that means they need to hire more labor. So we would imagine that there's a positive relationship between the output level and the demand for labor. On the other side, of course, when they demand labor, there's a cost of labor, and that cost is the expected real wage. And now moving to more like a realistic situation, because as we said before, when you sign the contract, you sign the contract based on your expectation of the price level in the future, not based on the current price level. Okay, so if you expect inflation to rise in the future, then you will probably ask for a higher nominal wage now. Okay, because once you sign the contract, you don't have much power on changing that contract. So you have to wait until your contract expires, and then maybe you could renegotiate the terms of your contract. But now, so to be more, and also firms do the same thing. So firms and workers, they are more forward-looking, so they think about the expected price level. So in that sense, then, demand for labor does not depend on reality, or a more realistic situation does not depend on real wage. It depends on the expected real wage, meaning that you divide the nominal wage by the expected price level. And then we plot the demand for labor, the labor demand curve, which is a downward sloping curve. We plot this on the W. So we have on the vertical axis, we have nominal wages, and on the horizontal axis, we have employment. So remember, so in the previous slide, we had the real wage on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal axis. But now we talk about nominal wage on the vertical axis and employment on the horizontal axis. From the other side, so this is the demand side. Looking at the supply side, again, we said household supply, or are the suppliers of labor. And what determines the labor supply here is mainly, again, is expected real wage. So it's W, so nominal wage divided by expected price level, and that is an upward sloping curve, again on the same space, W and in space. And you see here now how expectation play an important role in both demand and supply curves. Of course, as you may imagine now, or as you may recall from last time, equilibrium point, or the contractual wage, or the equilibrium W, or nominal wage, is determined at the intersection point between the labor supply and labor demand for given expectations, or for given level of expectation or expected prices. Again, we just go back to the same point. When the actual price equals the expected price level, that means this intersection point will determine, or will denote, the natural rate of employment, given that the variable we measure on the horizontal axis is employment, not unemployment. So that means that point, again, it's the same condition, or the same assumption we made when we discussed this using the wage setting relation and price setting relation. We said if that intersection point will be the natural rate of unemployment, because we had unemployment on the horizontal axis, so that will be the natural rate of unemployment. But here, when we because we have the employment or N on the horizontal axis, so that means the intersection point between labor supply and demand for labor and both curves, that intersection point denotes actually the natural rate of employment, given or if the actual price equal the expected price level. But in reality, we could have a situation, or in the short run, we could have a situation where actual price actually deviate from, or actual price level deviates from the expected price level. So they are not, both are not the same. So if, for example, price level was higher, so the actual price level was higher than expected, that means the demand curve will shift to the right, and that means we will have a temporary positive employment gap, meaning that now we would have the actual employment will be actually somewhere above the natural rate of employment, okay? And that gap will be filled by those who are looking for jobs, okay? And that's, as I said, that's something temporary, and as I said, that means it will be above the natural rate of employment. The other case, if the actual prices were lower than the expected price, that means the labor demand curve will shift to the left, and that means we have a negative employment gap, and that means more people will be looking for jobs. So, and that means the natural or the actual employment rate will be below the natural rate of employment. So we saw how when contract exists, we see that W, or the nominal wage, is determined by expectation, by actual employment is determined by the actual demand for labor, which, as we said, it could be, again, we could have a level of employment that is above or below the natural rate of employment. And one more thing we discussed again is what we mean by this natural rate of employment. It actually corresponds to what we called earlier is the natural rate of unemployment, which is the sum of two types of unemployment: frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. We said the frictional unemployment, when people move between jobs, there's some time in between they spend unemployed, or this time they looking for jobs. So that's called, this is the frictional unemployment. Structural unemployment, when you have people with skills that do not necessarily match the skills that are required. So you have jobs that that require some skills that, and also you have workers who are looking for jobs, but they have different set of skills. So this kind of mismatch between both sides, this is what we call the structural unemployment. So the sum of these two, so just to not be confused with this, so the natural rate of unemployment doesn't mean 0% unemployment rate. It doesn't mean 0% unemployment rate. Okay, it rather means that the cyclical unemployment, which happens due to a shortage in demand for goods and services, that one equals zero. So the cyclical unemployment would be equal zero, and the natural rate of unemployment would be the sum of frictional and structural unemployment. So at that point, we'll be at the natural rate of unemployment, and in other words, that will be the full employment output level, or the potential output. We use this to drive the aggregate supply curve. So if you remember, we moved from labor market, we added the production function, and then we had the 45-degree line as a mirror just to see different combination of price and output level. And then we saw how what shifts aggregate supply curve. If there's a rise in expected price level, that means the aggregate supply curve will shift upward. If there is a fall in expected prices or price level, that means the aggregate supply curve will shift downward. So that's everything we did. But what we're going to do today, we're going actually to build on what we did not just last time, before that as well today. So just to make things clear, in the medium run, we know that prices and wage contracts are due for renewal, so kind of more flexible compared to the short run. So in the short run, you remember we didn't discuss prices at all. We didn't talk about prices at all. We took prices as given, but now it's time to think about prices. How prices are determined, okay? So in what we consider to be rigid or fixed in the short run, we now have the chance to think about how this might change and it become more, not perfectly flexible as it would be in the long run, as you will see today, but it will be kind of sticky. So it can be like kind of slow, but still it can change. So of course, because in the medium run, all agents, firms, and households or workers, they actually react according to up-to-date market conditions. So now they see how the prices are changing, and also if they expect the prices to rise, then they probably ask for, now they have, given that this is time to renew contracts, now they would require, or they would ask higher wages. So what we did last time, we focus on wages, what determine wages. This lecture will be mainly focusing on prices, and to be more specific, what we did or we going to bring pieces together from what we did before. So in lecture 7, we derived the aggregate demand curve, downward sloping curve. We used the ISLM model, lecture 7, to drive that. Last week, we used those 4 diagrams starting from the labor market equilibrium on the production, and then in the production function, moving to the 45-degree line and going back to the P and Y space. We drive the aggregate supply curve. So basically now we have 2 sides. Okay, we have the aggregate demand. We know how it looks like. We have the aggregate supply. We know more about the aggregate supply now, given that how it is different from the short run to the medium run, moving toward the long run. So if we bring these pieces together, then we will know what determine prices, or how the price level is determined in an economy. Just before we move to that point, just you should notice that people or agents in general, economic agents in general, are concerned about the percent change in price, which is the inflation rate, more than the price itself. So let's now, as I say, let's now put these pieces together, the aggregate demand and aggregate supply and curves, and see how this work, or how can we use this analytical framework to understand how prices and output level are determined in the short run and in the long run as well. So just to remind you, just moving from the short run toward the long run, we're moving from a price level that we assume to be fixed. So most prices do not change in the very short run, but then moving toward the long run, we would expect that all prices to be flexible. And when I talk about prices here, I actually include wages as well. Just think of wages here as the price of labor. Okay, so all prices in the long run should be more flexible, so it can adjust according to what drive the equilibrium in the macroeconomy, which we will look at today. Okay, so so let's just as I said, we need to put the pieces together. So we want to talk about the aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and what determine prices, and how, what if, and then we will be saying a lot of what if today. So what if there's an expansionary monetary policy? What if there's an expansionary monetary policy? How this is going to determine or affect the output level and the price level in the short run, then moving to the long run, how the outcome will be different based on whether we're looking at the short run or the long run. So as I said, so the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model is kind of just think of this as a very convenient and very simple analytical framework that we can use to understand economic fluctuations in the economy, and also we can understand the effect of different policies on the equilibrium output and price level. So we want to have a convenient or a simple tool to do so. So aggregate demand and aggregate supply is probably one of these toolkits that are used by macroeconomists and also policymakers to understand the effect of different economic policies on the economy. So as we said, it shows the price level and aggregate output, how they are determined, and what if there's change in policy, what if there's a policy shift, how this is going to affect both Y and P, or the output level and price level. And that's, again, you need to think about where we are. Is it the short run? Is it the long run? How prices are fixed, or are they sticky, or they very flexible or perfectly flexible? So this is something we will talk about. So we'll see also how the economy behaves differently based on whether we are in the short run or in the long run. So that's kind of the big framework. That's the big picture we want to look at today. What you see is the aggregate demand curve, which we already derived before using the ISLM model, and we said this is a downward sloping curve. just remember you have the price level on the vertical axis and the output level Y on the horizontal axis, and this kind of negative relationship between the price and output level. And we explained when we drive this using the ISLM model, we explained the logic or the intuition behind why we see a downward sloping curve or aggregate demand curve. So all the interesting stuff, all the exciting stuff that we did before, they are still relevant. So you need to think about what shift the aggregate demand to the right, what can shift the aggregate demand to the left. Obviously, if we have, for example, if we have an expansionary monetary policy, so what does that mean? What do we mean by an expansionary monetary policy? That's a question, by the way. So what do you mean by an expansionary monetary policy? Yes? The other way. Yes. Okay, increasing money supply, yes, or decreasing the interest rate, or lowering the interest rate, okay? So remember what we said before. We said when we plot the IS and LM curve, the LM curve, whether it is a horizontal line or upward sloping curve, that will depend on what is the policy variable that the central bank chooses. We said most modern banks use the interest rate, so they choose the interest rate and then they adjust the money supply accordingly. So in that case, the LM curve will be horizontal. If they choose to change money supply, and then the interest rate will adjust accordingly, so that means it's upward sloping LM curve. But this is something we did in lecture 7, I think. So now we just need to focus on what can shift that aggregate demand to the right, what can shift that aggregate demand curve to the left. Obviously, if we have an expansionary monetary policy, that means increasing money supply, that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. If we have a reduction in money supply, that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So that's a contractionary monetary policy that will, and again, having an expansionary monetary policy, meaning increasing money supply, which would lower the interest rate. Fiscal policy is the same, so has the same effect. So if we have an expansionary fiscal policy, okay, that will shift. So what do we mean by an expansionary fiscal policy? So when we talk about fiscal policy, we talk about government spending and taxes. Is that right? Okay. So increasing government spending or reducing taxes, that means this is an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay, and that would shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. A contractionary policy has the opposite effect. So what do you mean by a contractionary fiscal policy? Again, so you reduce or government spending falls and or taxes increase. So that's a contractionary fiscal policy, and how that changed the position of the aggregate demand curve. It shifts to the left. Okay, this is not new, by the way. We've done this before when we drive the aggregate demand curve using the IS and LM curve. So you should remember that from before. If you don't remember, then that's a good time to remember that, because we need to understand, we need that to what is going to follow now. We need to understand that in order to understand what we're going to build on that. So how about the aggregate supply curve? Well, the aggregate supply curve we derived last time was upward sloping curve. It was that one in the middle, okay? So remember, we used the information from the labor market and what we learned about the medium run. We thought that prices might be a little bit more flexible compared to how it is in the short run, also compared to how it would be in the long run. Okay, so it's not fixed, but it's still kind of sticky prices. It's very but still kind of change as well. So between being fixed and very flexible or perfectly flexible. And that's what we derived last time, the one in the middle, B here, okay? But also the one that we have been talking about when we discussed the, I think through the first 5 or 4 lectures, we were talking mainly about the short run. And every time we talk about the short run, what we said that we implicitly were, by assuming that prices are fixed, we implicitly saying that the aggregate supply curve is a horizontal line. So it's kind of fixed at a predetermined level of prices, and that means the equilibrium output, if you remember, that probably was from the second lecture we start talking about that equilibrium output in the short run is determined mainly by the aggregate demand. And that's why we spent really a long time trying to understand the main components of the aggregate demand. We talked about consumption function, we talked about the marginal propensity to consume and the multiplier effect, we talked about the investment, etc., all this sort of stuff. That's why we talked about it, because we know that in the short run, the output is determined mainly, the output level is determined mainly by the aggregate demand. Why? Because we assume fixed prices. That means the aggregate supply in the short run, if the prices are fixed, it plays no role in determining the equilibrium output. It's mainly it mainly depends on the aggregate demand. However, moving away from that assumption, which by the way is a very extreme assumption that we will actually discuss this today as well, how we when we relax this assumption, when we think about prices, that we allow prices to change, maybe not to become as flexible as it would be in the long run, but still it's not fixed, then that will result in what you see now in B, figure B here, which give you the upward sloping aggregate supply curve, which we derived last time. And then moving toward the long run, prices become perfectly flexible, okay? And that means you have a vertical aggregate supply curve. Why I put this now? Because we will go back now and talk about each one of those, but I want you to see the whole picture from before we start, okay? So in the short run, if we assume that prices are fixed, that means we have a horizontal aggregate supply curve. If prices are perfectly flexible, as it would be or as expected to be in the long run, so that means we have a vertical aggregate supply curve. If it is somewhere between these two, perfectly flexible or fixed, then we have the upward sloping aggregate supply curve. So we don't have this problem with the aggregate demand curve. We know that the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping. It's just a problem here is that what assumptions we make about prices, how prices change, or how easy or how flexible prices can change. So in the very short run, maybe firms do not, or not just firms, agents cannot, or firms, yes, do not want to change prices. Maybe they sign contracts that do not allow them to do so, but as time passes, that means they have more flexibility and they could actually change prices according to new conditions, and also that applies to wages, as we explained before. Anyway, so now let's look at what the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model tell us about the short run. Okay, so as I said, we'll start with a very extreme case in which prices are fixed. Okay, and see how we build on that. What determines equilibrium? We already know that from before. So extreme case 1. Now in the short run, we assume prices are fixed, so that means we have a horizontal aggregate supply curve, and that means equilibrium price level will be fixed at a predetermined level, and that output level, or the equilibrium output, will be determined slowly and mainly by the aggregate demand. Okay, so what does that mean? What implications do this have on equilibrium or in the macroeconomy? So that means changes to the demand side policies. When I talk about demand side policies, any policies that can can shift the aggregate demand curve. Remember, that's why I said here you need really to understand what can shift the aggregate demand curve. So now demand side policies will have, or changing government spending or taxes or money supply will have real effect, meaning it will have effect on real output, okay, but it will have no nominal effect. So it's not going to change the price level. Again, remember, that's based on the assumption that price level is fixed, okay? So any change in any policy shift, demand side policy, I mean, so talking about government spending, taxes, or money supply, that means will result in change in real output, so it has some real impact or real effect, but it's not going to have nominal effect, meaning it's not going to change the price level. So the assumption we make here about price level, or that the prices are fixed, that means that firms are willing to sell as much at that price as their customers are willing to buy. So any amount demanded at that price level, firms are willing to provide. Okay, and that's why you see a horizontal aggregate, short-run aggregate supply curve. But yet, assuming that all prices are fixed, might be very extreme case, as we said, might be very extreme assumption. That again, we will relax this assumption later and see how that affects our understanding of the aggregate supply or aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and how that can be used to analyze different economic policies and equilibrium in the macroeconomy. But yet, why do we do that? Because this extreme assumption make it easy for us having that horizontal short-run aggregate supply curve, meaning that changes in the aggregate demand or shifts to the aggregate demand is not going to change prices. We'll be focusing mainly on what happened to the output level. But then in the other case, when we have upward sloping aggregate supply curve, we would see that the direction of the effect would be very similar to what we have in this case when the aggregate supply curve is horizontal. But the only difference that price will change as well. So now in this case, this extreme case, prices do not change. We just assume, we take it as given, it's fixed, and that makes our analysis much simpler. But then later on, our understanding of this might not be difficult to see that both actually different shocks or different changes in policy would result in we'll move in the same direction in terms of the output level, and then we'll see how prices will respond to that. So equilibrium in the short run. So now, again, we're just putting those pieces together. So given all what we said now about the price level and how it is horizontal and how it is fixed at a predetermined level and what that means. So having this, that means now the equilibrium point, and this is the short run equilibrium. Okay, so we'll be at that point where the aggregate demand, which is downward sloping curve, intersect with the short run aggregate supply curve. And we, again, P here has this bar, means P here is fixed, so it doesn't change. So that's a fixed level or a predetermined level of prices. And this is the output level, again, that's determined mainly or slowly by the aggregate demand. So any changes to this level will happen only because there's a shift in the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so whether the aggregate demand curve shift to the right or to the left, that will change the output level. So as you can see here, for example, let's say in the short run, because prices are fixed, this is where they are. So this is the short run aggregate supply curve, assuming fixed prices. Now let's assume that there is for whatever reason, there is a fall in aggregate demand. So aggregate demand So the first equilibrium point is A, and the next equilibrium point, or the second equilibrium point when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left, is point B. So what we see now, so the equilibrium output is lower now, is below the initial equilibrium output, and that's again because the shift in the aggregate demand. So the aggregate supply, or the short-run aggregate supply, played no role in determining where that output or equilibrium output will be. It's mainly because of the shift in the aggregate demand curve. I mean, obviously, if you look at the opposite case, where you have rightward or shifting the aggregate demand curve to the right, this will result in, let's say we have an expansionary monetary policy or an expansionary fiscal policy, given that prices are fixed now. So the new level, so we're moving from Y1 to Y2. When aggregate demand changed from aggregate demand 1 to aggregate demand 2, you see the short-run aggregate supply is fixed. It didn't move. So the new level or the new equilibrium for Y here, which is Y2, is mainly determined by the position of the aggregate demand, which is the right one. So the red one, the one in the red color. Okay, and now we move to another equilibrium point, a short-run equilibrium point, which on the right of the initial one, because we have an expansionary fiscal policy or an expansionary monetary policy, or for whatever reason that shifted the aggregate demand curve to the right. Now the new equilibrium point is mainly determined because of that shift of the aggregate demand. Okay, so how the economy will look like in the long run. Okay, so there is a kind of a tendency in the economy to move to the long run equilibrium. Remember, what did we say about the long run aggregate supply curve? It's a vertical curve. Okay, it's a vertical line. So basically, whatever this is, because this could be, as we said before, in the short run, the economy could be moving like or fluctuating around the long run equilibrium. Okay, so it could be above or below the full employment output level. So that can happen in the short run, as we said before, and we'll see more about this now. Okay, but in the long run, there will be like some tendency, or it will converge, it will go, or it will move toward the long run equilibrium, which is the intersection between the aggregate demand curve and the long run aggregate supply curve, which is a vertical line, and that line here, or that level here, Y bar here, is the full employment output level. That means that all resources are fully employed, but it doesn't mean, I just have to say that again, it doesn't mean that the unemployment rate is 0%. Okay, so at that point, do you remember what's the unemployment rate at that point? That will equal both fractional plus structural unemployment. It means that cyclical unemployment equal 0. Okay, at that level, and then that would be the full employment output level. Okay, so just what I'm trying to say here is, this is the equilibrium in the short run. It could be anywhere, but in the long run, we'll be moving toward that point where the aggregate demand intersect with the long run aggregate supply, which is a vertical axis. This doesn't have to be the case. Now the short run aggregate supply just happened to be intersecting with the aggregate demand at the same point in the long run, but in the short run, this could be anywhere. Okay, so that could happen before the full employment output level, or above the full employment output level. So it could happen anywhere. So let's now just before we conclude this part of the lecture, Let's just move to the opposite case or the other extreme case, which is the long run. Okay, hopefully now the short run, the main assumption we have now is that we have fixed prices. Okay, that makes the short run aggregate supply curve horizontal, and that makes the equilibrium output determined slowly by the position of the aggregate demand curve and what happened to the aggregate demand curve, okay, in the short run. And as we said, that could happen before or after the full employment level, which happened in the long run. In the long run, we expect now we have a vertical aggregate supply curve. So the second case, or the other extreme case now, or extreme case 2, where nominal rigidity, or that fixed prices we assumed in the short run or in the very short run, and the sticky prices that we may think about, even if we relax the assumption that prices are fixed and we move to a more realistic case when we think about sticky prices, it moves, but it's not very flexible as it will be in the long run. In the long run, all these are not an issue now, because in the long run, we would imagine that prices, including wages, are perfectly flexible, and that's why you have a vertical long run aggregate supply curve. And that means equilibrium output here. Remember, in the very short run, when we assumed fixed prices, equilibrium output was determined slowly by the aggregate demand. Here, the equilibrium output will be fixed at a certain level where the aggregate supply curve, the long run aggregate supply curve, lies, and the aggregate demand, or the role of the aggregate demand shifts now, will have nominal effects, not real effects. Meaning, when you shift the aggregate demand curve up or downward, upward or downward, that effect will be mainly on the price level, not on the output level. So changes in the demand side policies will have no real effect. It mainly will be nominal effect, meaning it will affect mainly the price level, not the output level, because output level is determined by the position of that vertical long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, moving the aggregate demand curve upward or downward will only affect the price level. So just one more point to highlight, which where or what determined that the position of that long run aggregate supply curve. We talked about that's exactly the full employment output level, or the potential output, or where the natural rate of unemployment, or where the unemployment rate is at the natural rate of unemployment. All the ideas we discussed, but again, remember that at this level, the unemployment rate is not zero. The unemployment rate is at its natural level. Okay, so let me stop here at this point. In the next part of the lecture, in the next section of this lecture, we'll carry on with this, and we'll see what would happen to equilibrium in the short run and the long run. What will happen when we have shocks to the economy. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next part of the lecture. Thank you. So in the first half of this lecture, we looked at the aggregate demand curve. We saw how the aggregate supply curve will look like in 3 different cases when we assume fixed prices. In the very short run, if prices are not allowed to change, or for whatever reason they don't change. And then we try to compare this to the long run case, but looking at the short run, having a horizontal aggregate supply curve, short run aggregate supply curve, means that equilibrium output is determined slowly by the aggregate demand, and we saw what can shift the aggregate demand to the right or to the left, whether we having an expansionary monetary policy or an expansionary fiscal policy will move or will shift the aggregate demand curve to the right. Having a contractionary policy that will move or shift the aggregate demand to the left. In the long run, we said we expect that prices, including wages, to be perfectly flexible, and that's why we have a vertical line. So the long run aggregate supply curve is a vertical line, and we're not talking about rigid or fixed prices. We talk about flexible prices that can change, and that means the output level is determined at certain level given by this, the position of this long run aggregate supply curve, and any changes to the aggregate demand curve, any shifts for the aggregate demand curve will have nominal effect, not real effect. So this means it's not going to change the real output, is going mainly to change the price level. And that implies that demand side policies will have only nominal effect, not real effect in the long run. Just remember, we are talking now about the long run. And we explained that where that long run aggregate supply will lie, it's basically at the full employment output level. And we explained that this means that the unemployment rate is at the natural rate of unemployment rate, and it doesn't mean that the unemployment rate will equal 0. It means that the unemployment rate will equal the sum of frictional unemployment and structural unemployment. It means that the cyclical unemployment is 0. Moving from here, this is what we looked at. We're looking at a vertical line, and that's the long run aggregate supply curve. So as you can see, Y has like a bar on it, so that means it's fixed at this level. So whatever changes happen to the aggregate demand, so moving the aggregate demand up or down, so shifting the aggregate demand upward or downward, is not going to have any real effect, meaning it's not going to change real output. It's mainly going to affect price level. As you can see, if we start from point A, where we have this aggregate demand, the first aggregate demand, then moving downward to the red line or the red aggregate demand curve, AD2, again, all what happened here is just we have a lower P price level, which is P2, but nothing happened or nothing changed related to the real GDP. So the real GDP hasn't changed. Similarly, if you move upward as well, so mainly here what we're trying to say here is that the position of the aggregate demand or shifting the aggregate demand will mainly, in the long run, will mainly affect price level, the price level, not the real GDP. So you can imagine now the effect of an expansionary or a contractionary fiscal policy in the long run. Okay, so what we see here, we have the three curves. We have the long run aggregate supply, which is a vertical curve, and also we have the short run aggregate supply, which we assume to be horizontal because we assume that prices are fixed. But at the same time, we have the aggregate demand curve, which in this case, what you see on the screen now, there's an expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. That means the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. So if we start from point A as an initial equilibrium point, moving, having an expansionary monetary or fiscal policy will shift the aggregate demand to the right, and that means in the short run we will have a temporary equilibrium point here in the short run, which is point B, where the aggregate demand 2 intersect with the short run aggregate supply, which is the horizontal line. So that point B, which if you notice here, you see that it's beyond or above the full employment output level. So we have some sort of inflationary gap, or the actual output level is above the natural output level or the full employment output level, which means, again, we explained that before, that in the short run, economic activities can be or can fluctuate around the long the long run equilibrium point, or the full employment output level, as we can see now. But this situation is not sustainable, so it's not going to continue to the long run, because the only reason we have this point here is that because we assume prices are fixed, and that's why we have this point Y, which is above the full employment output level. And over time, we imagine that prices will be more flexible, or this extra or this additional demand, or this high demand will put upward pressure on the price level, and so will remain at point B as long as we are in the short run. But since we assume that moving away from the short run, prices are more flexible, okay, that means we will move on that red line. So we move, so prices will respond to that high demand. That means we will move along the aggregate demand up back to point C, which is toward the long run equilibrium. And what happened here, we went back to the same level of output, but then we have higher price level, which is above, which C is above C. Point C above point B, which is the initial equilibrium point. So the main point here that is in the short run, you could have a temporary or short run equilibrium point where you find the intersection point between the aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve. But this, in the long run, as prices including wages become more flexible, then they will respond to this sort of pressure. And here in this case, we have upward pressure. So it's pushing the higher demand, pushing the prices up, and that's how we move along that red aggregate demand curve back to the equilibrium point, to the long run equilibrium point, which is point C. So where the aggregate demand to intersect with the long run aggregate supply curve. So this is the long run effect of an expansionary fiscal or monetary policy. So now we shift the aggregate demand, and this, as we said before, it will have no real impact in the long run, meaning it's not going to change the real output where it remains the same, but what has changed here is the price level. So it means it has nominal effect rather than real effect. And this exactly explains the process. This is exactly what I said now. So similarly, if you have a contractionary fiscal or monetary policy, that will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. And again, because we assume that prices are fixed in the short run, you will have a temporary or a short run equilibrium point, which is point B here. But again, because now this is a lower demand, again, that will put downward pressure on prices. You move along that red line here, or the aggregate demand too, and then you move back, going back to point C, which is the long run equilibrium point, which again, the real output hasn't changed, it hasn't moved, but then we have a different price level. So why we do this? So from what we see now, obviously this is a recessionary gap. So recessionary gap means the actual output here is below the full employment output level, which means now we have, by the way, the unemployment rate will be higher than the natural rate of unemployment, meaning at this point, or in this situation, cyclical unemployment is not zero. Okay, now there's shortage in demand, and that's why cyclical unemployment is positive at this point. Okay, so, and the the actual unemployment rate is below the full employment, or below, sorry, the so then the actual unemployment rate is actually above the natural rate of unemployment. So that means we have more unemployment than the natural rate of unemployment. So what does that tell us? It tells us that in the short run, economic activities can fluctuate around the long run equilibrium. And that's what we know as the business cycle. So you see the although we know that in the long run the economy tend to move or converge to the long run equilibrium, but on the way that it's like a bumpy road, so it goes through a long way that is full of ups and downs all the way on the long run trend. So what you see here is just a graph that show you how that works, or you have real GDP in the vertical axis and show you how economic activities usually go through booms and then come to a peak point and then go back to recession, and then it become below the long run trend, so means there's depression. Then you go to the bottom point here with the trough here, and then you go back to recovery again. So it goes like into cycles. So how does real data support this sort of graph that you see now? This is what you see here. This is for the US economy. So what you see here is the real GDP growth, and that line here is the aggregate, or is the average growth rate. So just think of that as the long run trend, and you see how GDP growth is going above and below that line. So the shaded areas here show you the times where there was a recession in the US, or the US economy went through recession. You see how GDP or real GDP fluctuates around that trend, so up and down, and that's very similar to what we see in this graph. So again, why do we, as I said in the beginning, one reason why we find the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model useful is to be able to use this framework to analyze this sort of economic fluctuations, and also to analyze the effect of different economic policies at the same time. So that's what we're going to look at now, the effect of different shocks, and it's a very convenient way, or the model here, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, provide a very simple toolkit to analyze business cycles and how this relate to real world when you see recessions and booms, how that can link to policy as well. How can we understand what type of policies we need to help the economy to recover, or help the economy if it was overheated to go back to the full employment output level. So what we mean here, anything that shifts, what we mean by shocks here is anything that could shift aggregate demand or short-run aggregate supply. That will create, so this is itself, we call it a shock, but it should be like unexpected change. So something that we didn't expect, because otherwise if economic agents expect a change, then they will adjust their behavior accordingly. So if they anticipate some change, then they will behave based on that. But the shock here means that was unexpected change that happened, that caused a shift to aggregate demand or the short-run aggregate supply, and that will create a new macroeconomic equilibrium point. So in that sense, you can think of the shock as an exogenous change in aggregate supply or aggregate demand. Okay, and again, the change comes as a complete surprise, something that you didn't account for. And as I said, it is unexpected, because if it was anticipated, if it was expected, then economic agents usually react or respond or adjust accordingly, so it wouldn't have the same effect as if it was a surprising shock or something that economic agents didn't see coming. So these shocks push the economy away from full employment. Remember that full employment level, when you see that vertical line, Y bar, this is where the full employment level is. And then these shocks could be negative shocks or positive shocks. So obviously negative shocks, you would imagine that this sort of shocks will decrease output and will increase unemployment. And positive shocks may increase production or output and reduce unemployment. The effect on inflation will depend on whether it is a supply shock or a demand shock. So that means we have two types of shocks, demand shocks and supply shocks. And what we're trying to do here now, we try to look at each type of these shocks and see how this affects equilibrium and how policymakers may respond to these types of shocks. So let's start with just looking at first at demand shocks. So when we talk about demand shocks, again, it's unexpected change that can shift the aggregate demand curve either to the right or to the left. Okay, it would be a positive shock, a positive demand shock if it shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. If it is a negative shock, that means it will shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. So the idea here, what sort of examples, like, so there are so many examples of what can be considered as aggregate demand shock. Let's say if what happened after the 2008 when we had the stock market crash. So that means investors and consumers, they cut spending again because they lost confidence or they have lower confidence in the economy. Different or other examples can be related to a recession in a neighboring country where you have trade links. And I think one of the examples also we've seen during the global financial crisis, as we explained in one of the lecture, it was mainly the transmission of the shock happened mainly through trade links. So some countries were not really involved, were not very well integrated in the world, in the financial markets, world financial markets. But then because of what happened to world demand or global demand, then those countries, or especially those small countries, they actually suffer from the shock because of trade links. So what I'm trying to say here, that was a negative demand shock, okay? So that was mainly a negative demand shock. So if there is a recession in a trade partner country, so that means their demand on our product will drop, and that is a negative demand shock. Well, if anything happened, let's say some economic reform policies or new reform programs were underway, so that maybe has increased confidence in the economy. Again, that is a positive demand shock. So people will tend to make, investors will make plans to expand their investments. Also, consumers will expand their spending, etc. Based, again, it's kind of how optimistic these economic agents about the economy and how it behaves in the future is. So, so these are different examples of what we can consider as an aggregate or a demand shock. So, and as I said before, demand shock could be positive or negative. So if we have a positive demand shock, that means the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. If we have a negative demand shock, that means the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. And if prices adjust, if prices can move gradually, I would say the gradual adjustment here comes from the fact that prices in the very short run are fixed, but then they become less rigid or more flexible as we move away from the short run. So that's why we talk about the gradual adjustment of prices can actually take the economy back to toward the full employment output level. So this would summarize what happened in time of demand shock. So if we have a positive demand shock, we already know now what would happen to the aggregate demand curve. But then, as you may imagine now, or may have expected, the positive demand shock will push output upward, and unemployment rate will fall. The adjustment that happened in the price level will increase. P will increase, or the price level will increase. The negative demand shock would have the opposite effect, or the effect will move the opposite direction. So if we have a negative demand shock, that means again aggregate demand curve will shift left, the output level will drop, and then unemployment rate will increase, and the adjustment to prices will be more downward pressure on prices. So just as an example, this is a kind of shock that I was talking about. Again, it's something similar to what we have seen already when we have a fall in aggregate demand for whatever reason. Let's say consumers had less confidence in whatever some shock happened that lowered the consumers' confidence in the economy, so they cut back their spending, or maybe the same thing happened to investors, so aggregate demand curve shift to the left. And then, as I said before, this sort of that means we are operating, or the economy is operating below the full employment level, output level, and that will put some downward pressure because on prices, because we have now, and again, prices include wages as well. So that means we will move along that red, or the new aggregate demand curve, going back to point C, which is the long run equilibrium. So that is a negative demand shock, and I guess now we can already understand the positive, the long run impact of a positive demand shock. So how about supply shocks? So supply shocks, again, or in a similar way. So supply shocks, we talk about unexpected change that will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so that is because it will affect costs, and it will affect the prices firm charge. So basically, just think of the markup. You remember, so that will change the aggregate supply, or the short-run aggregate supply curve. So an example of this. A bad weather that reduces crop yields, pushing up food prices, or maybe economic agents, for whatever reason, they expect higher price level in the future. So again, all this will be translated into shifts to, or in the short-run aggregate supply, which means it translates to a negative supply shock. If we have a favorable or positive supply shock, that means it should lower costs, it should lower prices, and that means it will shift the short-run aggregate supply curve downward. Remember, what we're looking at here in the short run, we're looking at a horizontal line, because we still under the assumption that prices are fixed in the short run. Okay. So in that case, okay, if we have a positive or a favorable supply shock, that means this supply or short-run aggregate supply curve will shift downward, prices will be less, the same for cost as well. If we have a negative supply shock, that means that curve will be pushed upward, and that means higher prices, higher cost as well. Okay, so how this work, again, in a similar way, if you want to summarize the effects of a supply shock, we're looking here at, again, what would happen to the short-run aggregate supply curve as a result of a positive or a negative supply shock. But also equally important, you should understand what would happen, or what we expect for output level. So obviously, if we have a favorable supply shock, that means output will increase, and employment will fall, and then the price level will fall as well. But then again, just remember this sort of gradual adjustment that bring equilibrium in the long run. It takes time for prices to change. So I'm saying here, we started with the assumption that prices are fixed, but this fixed prices assumption is in the very short run. But then as we move away from the short run, the economy has the chance to adjust, or to go back, or to return to the full employment output level through this adjustment in prices, which include adjustment to wages as well. Remember, as I said in the first half of this lecture, wages, you could look at wages as the price of labor. So it's the same thing, okay? So it's included. When I talk about adjusting prices, obviously you would imagine that wages will be adjusted as well. Again, we're talking about in the long run. So all prices are fixable, so they change in the long run. So they can change in the long run. So in the very short run, we accept this assumption, this extreme assumption that all prices are fixed. But then what you see here in this table is talking about, okay, what sort of adjustment will happen to the price level as a result of a supply shock. Okay, so moving from here, then we want to see how this will translate. How can we translate this on this equilibrium graph, where we have the long-run aggregate supply and the short-run aggregate supply curve, and also the aggregate demand curve. So let's assume now we have a negative supply shock. Okay, so again, a negative or an adverse supply shock means that the short-run aggregate supply curve will be pushed upward. So that means higher cost, higher prices. And if we start from point A here, if that's our initial equilibrium point, after the shock or because of the shock, that short-run aggregate supply 1 will shift to short-run aggregate supply 2. So that means in the short run, the equilibrium point will be point B, where the aggregate demand intersects with the short-run aggregate supply 2, and now the output will fall as a result of a negative or an adverse supply shock. Okay, so again, the adjustment that would expect to happen here, which would expect this sort of adjustment to happen through prices until we go back to the full employment output level. But we could also, but before we jump, also how to use economic policy, how different economic policies can stabilize the economy in times of economic shocks. One example of these, a very popular example that I'm sure that you may have come across this example, is oil price shocks. So oil price shocks, what you see here, the oil price from 1970s up to 2015. And what you will see here, if you look at the, of course, we have two scales here, different scales, one on the right hand side and one on the left hand side. So the blue one, which is the oil prices in dollars, for which the scale is on the left hand side. So you will see how the prices, the blue line has increased in 1970s. That was the first oil shock, and then late 1970s a second shock, and then you'll see here maybe during the 2000 how oil prices shot up like this before the global financial crisis. It dropped, and then since 2014 it's actually going in a downward trend. So we have two different types of shocks here. So the first one, when oil prices increase, what type of shock is that? When oil prices increase, is it a demand shock or supply shock? Is it positive or negative shock? That's a question. Yeah. Yes, so it's a negative supply shock, okay? So if oil price increases, it's a negative supply shock because it increased costs, increased prices, and that will push the short-run aggregate supply curve upwards. So as I said, we have two sharp increases, and then in 2000, 1970s and 2000 as well, and also there's a massive drop here after 2014 for different reasons. This slide just tries to explain why these changes may have happened. 1970s, that was because OPEC, or the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, cut production. They act as a monopolist, and then they cut production. Of course, that will increased oil prices. In 2000, what happened is it's just because emerging economies, and they were fast growing, and there were high demand from emerging economies, that increased demand for oil, and of course that increased oil prices. In 2008, we all know that there was a recession, so that means lower demand for oil. In 2014, different reasons or a combination of reasons. So increased supply because of the US shale oil, and also because of the strategy that OPEC followed in after 2014, or maybe because they couldn't agree on cutting the production to push the prices back up again. So whatever the reason is, what we see in the data, we see this massive increase, or this increase in oil prices in 1970s, and similar increase in 2000, and then there's a fall after the recession after 2008, and then also after 2014. So what we think here, so we have, of course, this is, as you said, it's a negative supply shock because it affects cost of production, it affects prices, and that means we would expect the short-run aggregate supply curve will shift upwards, and that means Y and employment, or output and employment, will fall. If there was no other shock or another oil price shock, maybe this sort of adjustment that we explain, if prices adjust, maybe that will allow the economy to go back to the full employment output level. This shows you some data from the US economy 1970s after the price shock. So what can you see here? The red line here is the change in oil prices on the left scale, and the blue line here is the inflation rate, and the green line is the unemployment rate. So what you see here is how the impact of the oil shock, that prices have gone up. That's what we imagine. We said if we have a negative or an adverse an adverse supply shock, that will increase costs, prices, that will shift prices up, and also it will shift output down, and also unemployment rate has increased, which is the green line here. The economy, so this data up to 1977, so from 1973 when the first shock started, but because what happened in late 1970, so it was followed by a second shock, a second oil price shock, and that was associated with the revolution in Iran, one of the one of the major oil exporting countries. And again, we'll see what happened here. So if you look at what this here, so unemployment rate was kind of recovering or going down when inflation was kind of slowing, when the oil price was slowing down here, inflation was slowing down. But then after that, you will see that there was again another shock of oil prices, and that was followed. You will see this clearly in this graph, because this will show us after not just 1997, also up to 1981. You will see that inflation has gone up again. So the unemployment rate has increased as well. So that was kind of, oh, actually I was looking at the wrong graph. This one. So that was up. So the inflation rate, this is the oil prices, this is the unemployment rate. So in the second graph, we will see this, which extend this to 1980s, because in 1982, at this point here, this point what I'm looking at here, there was a drop in oil prices, the red line, and again, just look at the left scale, and then that helped, like you see what happened to inflation rate was falling, and as we would expect, the unemployment rate was kind of improving at that time. So, and that is because a favorable supply shock in 1981. A favorable supply shock here, that means the oil prices fell, and that was by about 10% in 1982. So what do we learn from this? So what we've seen so far, okay, we saw that output can, or economic or the equilibrium point, or where we're looking at the output or the full employment output level, can be is determined actually by the long run aggregate supply, but then the actual equilibrium point in the short run can be somewhere around that level. And that can happen mainly because of policy shift or any intervention like monetary policy, expansionary policy, or expansionary fiscal policy, or because of different types of shocks, demand shocks or negative shocks. So policies, so rather than relying on this gradual adjustment of prices to take the economy back to recovery or to the equilibrium point, we could actually use stabilizing policies, which is something we covered before, which we're talking here mainly about fiscal policy and monetary policy. So policy actions that are aimed at reducing the severity of a short run economic fluctuation. So say we're moving through a recession because of negative supply shock, then we can follow some kind of expansionary policy track where we have expansionary fiscal policy, expansionary monetary policy that would push the economy back to recovery. This show you example exactly what I mean here. So if we just look at this what we have here, we have an adverse shock. So we're already familiar with this now. So the moving from point A, which is the initial equilibrium point, we had the equilibrium, we had the short-run aggregate supply one. After the adverse shock, or because of the adverse shock, that curve, the short-run aggregate supply curve, moved upward to the short-run aggregate supply curve 2. And because here this change or this shock was made by an expansionary, let's say, monetary policy. So that means the aggregate demand curve will move or shift to the right from aggregate demand curve 1 to aggregate demand curve 2, which means rather than having to go through the painful process of going that or suffering from that adverse supply shock, we could actually compensate that, or aggregate demand can fill this, and then we just move from A to C. But what you can see here now, Y didn't change, so there's no change in output, but obviously will be at higher level here. So again, this was a response to an adverse supply shock, which shift the short-run aggregate supply upward, but then at the same time, when the central bank increased money supply or followed or applied an expansionary monetary policy, they were able to compensate for this. But of course, what we're looking at here, we have another equilibrium point, which is C. Okay, so output didn't suffer. We didn't have a recessionary gap, because without this action by the central bank, we'll see that this supposed to be the equilibrium point in the absence of the response or by the monetary authorities. So that means we would expect to have a recessionary gap if there was no action taken by the central bank. So if there was no change in monetary policy, so that means we should see some recessionary gap, meaning the actual output or real GDP should be, or the short-run level of GDP should be below the full employment level here. But because this was made by an expansionary policy, that helped to kind of going back to the long run trend, or the full employment output level, which is point C. But this come at the cost here, so now we have a higher price level as well. So as we said before, demand side policies in the long run, they have mainly nominal effect, meaning they don't change the long run output level, they mainly change the price level. Okay? Any questions? Okay, just to say, which is something I already mentioned in one of the tutorials today, what you will see in the exam, you'll see this sort of questions that need some analysis, that need some plotting some graphs and explaining those graphs in detail. So not just drawing a graph, this is not the answer. You really need to fully comment and fully explain your graph. So it's not just about showing a graph like this. It's more about how you, of course, that's part of your mark, but then it's really it's equally important how clearly you explain your graph in details as well. So yes, you might not have calculations, or you not might be assessed how you use math or mathematics the same way you were assessed in the class test, but in the exam you need this sort of analysis. You need to learn how to do this sort of analysis. So the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is a very useful way to think about this sort of questions. What happen if? So what if? So give you some scenarios, and then you need to learn how to approach this, how to provide an advice to policymaker. Okay. So what if I'll tell you, okay, so this is a situation, what would you do, or how would you advise a policymaker? Should they follow an expansionary fiscal policy or a contractionary monetary policy? How do they implement this? Show this in a graph, explain your answer, why, explain your reasons why you think this should be the policy response. Okay, so this, as I said, all what we learn with the ISLM model, with the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, this sort of, as I said, toolkit that you can use to provide this sort of analysis. So it's very important to try this and to see that you master this sort of graphs and how you do the graphs. Okay, so I'm just going briefly, because we're running out of time. So what I'm going to do now, so just let me summarize what we did so far, and then we'll see how much we can cover from the rest of this lecture. If not, we'll just take it, we'll move it on to the next lecture. So the whole story today is very simple. So we know the aggregate demand is downward sloping curve. The main story is around the aggregate supply curve. Okay, so aggregate supply curve in the short run, if you assume fixed prices, that means you have a horizontal curve. If you look at the long run, where prices are perfectly flexible, so all prices including wages, so you would expect a vertical line. So that's the long run aggregate supply curve. So as I said before, this could be kind of extreme assumption that we think that all prices are fixed in the short run. Maybe as we move away from the short run, prices become more flexible than they were in the short run or in the very short run, but then they're still less flexible compared to how they will be in the long run. So maybe if we look at the medium run, which is kind of between the short run and the long run, or as we move away from the short run, we expect that, okay, nominal prices and also wages, not completely fixed, not completely rigid, or not also completely flexible the way we saw, but more like sticky, so kind of not very as flexible as they will be in the long run, but they're not fixed. So that means our aggregate supply curve is not flat, so it's not horizontal line as the case when we assume fixed prices, or it's not yet vertical as the case we expect in the long run. Okay, so it'd be upward sloping curve, and that's exactly the curve we derived last lecture when we discussed the labor market. So we derived an upward sloping curve, and that means that P, or the price level, and the output level are jointly determined by the aggregate demand and the aggregate supply. So remember, when we have a horizontal aggregate supply curve, when we have a horizontal short-run aggregate supply curve, so the output level is slowly determined by the aggregate demand curve. So the position of the aggregate demand curve determines where the equilibrium is. When we have a vertical aggregate supply curve, the price level is slowly determined by the aggregate demand curve, but in the medium run, or whenever you relax the assumption that prices are fixed, when you have an upward sloping aggregate supply curve, that means the equilibrium point, which means both variables, the price level and the output, equilibrium output will be jointly determined by both the aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve. So now the equilibrium will depend where both curves are, and then we need to understand what shifts. Again, I guess now you are very familiar with this sort of analysis now, what shifts the aggregate demand curve. So we know any change in government spending, taxes, money supply, obviously will shift the aggregate demand curve, which we know now it's downward sloping curve. But then on the other side, expectations, or the expected price level, PE, if there's a change in price expectation, that will shift the aggregate supply curve. And this is something that we have already discussed in the previous lecture. I think I'll stop at this point, okay? And maybe next lecture we will extend this part a little bit, and we'll talk more about expectations. We'll see how we get on with the material. Do you have any questions? Any questions? Okay, thank you. See you next time.